I want to go back to the Colossians text and just remind us that one of the things that the text advises, that the apostle was advising the church was to avoid acting the way the world thinks and acts. So we're called to a new way of acting. We're called to this unformed task of representing the kingdom, living as if Jesus lived, died, and rose again. Easter living. That's what we're called to do. And the church is a way, an organization of commitment to do that. And that requires us to deal with difference. Now, I could go back to the biblical text to find differences in the community, right? The differences in the original community of disciples arose about the role of Gentiles in the church, how we went about the work. So having differences in the church is really nothing new. It goes way back. But I wanted to just set the context by remarking on 3 different ways that the Methodist Church in the United States has grappled with difference. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the history, but hopefully they are illustrative enough. If you know Methodist history, you know that in at the very origin of the Methodist Church here in the States, there was, at the Christmas conference in Baltimore in the 1700s, there was an early commitment to stand against slavery. And Bishop Asbury was very committed to that stand. And very soon thereafter, it began to be challenged in the lived experience of the church. Those first 20 years of the church had conversation about what that would be like. In 1844, the church actually split over that issue, among others. Just to know that no issue ever arises by itself. It's also important to be aware that there are other things that are going on. And one of the things that was at issue in the 1840s was the role of bishops. The Methodist movement in England didn't have bishops, and we had decided we would in the States, and so that was still being negotiated. So that was a conflict that was clearly a conflict in the culture in which the church was serving, and the church decided that the way to handle it was to divide. That's a way to handle conflict, right? It's just, and we've seen it in our history. We've also seen the work that it takes to reunite. So from the late 1800s all the way up to the Merging Conference in 1939, committees and conferences were working on how to come back together. From 1916 to 1939, people were working on it diligently. So we know some of that as well. I want to point to another issue that I want to mention is the church had a lot of debate and disagreement about women's ordination. This story maybe we know a little better. The role of women was debated in our culture and in our churches. The role of women missionaries was debated. I was thinking when we were talking about baptism earlier this morning that one of the early women missionaries made a speech to one of the mission conferences in London in the section on women's work with women, where she said, now women are spreading the gospel to women. We're helping them we're working in healthcare. We're helping them birth their babies, and maybe at some time we'll also be able to participate in baptizing those babies. 1888. Full clergy rights was not passed until the 1950s. So there was a long conversation about the role of women and how they could function in the tasks that are assigned to the ordained ministry. Different compromises were made in the overseas work. The local pastor's licenses were available before full clergy rights, so the church negotiated the role of women over a long period of time. And finally, in the 1950s, the issue was, in quotes, resolved by authority. The General Conference decided. The boards of ordained ministry implemented. The bishops appointed, right? So we used the processes of the church to drive the resolution. It reflected the consensus, or it reflected the majority at the General Conference, but it was not easy, as our clergy sisters would tell us, at the congregational level. So although the issue was resolved by a decision and by authority, it still had to be lived into. That's another way of resolving disputes. Live with it a while, we make a decision, and then we enforce the decision. A third example is, I wrote down historical criticism, but it deals with how we deal with the Bible. So in the early 1900s, the rise of scholarship and how we looked at the biblical text was a real challenge to the churches. It asked us to look at some of the things that United Methodist women take account of regularly. Who was the community to whom the text is addressed? Why was it written down? What was the context in which the story was being told? How did the original hearers listen to it? It was an attempt to move us away from picking a verse and, well, they didn't do it that way at the time, but I was going to say picking a verse and putting it on your mug. That's just to rip the language out of its context. It's not that those individual promises and joyful expressions don't have weight. Of course they do. But we read them in a context where we understand the Bible is more than a phrase book for us. That controversy was not resolved at a General Conference level. We've had lots of studies. Our theological task, the document called Our Theological Task, alludes to it, but it is, and it's been taken on by seminaries, bishops, boards of ministry, in an implementation kind of work, but it's still alive, right? So we have questions, we have ongoing questions at the university senate level about what seminaries are going to be accredited so that we receive clergy from them. And part of the issue is, of course, do they have a qualified person teaching United Methodist history, doctrine, and polity? That's we understand why that's one. But part of it is because we know that there is this ongoing difference of opinion about how we read and interpret the Bible, which connects to how we think about authority, which connects to how we think about humanity, which connects to the whole understanding of who the church is in the world and who God has called us to be. So I want to suggest that those are at least 3 examples of ways that the church has addressed differences of opinion, conflicting differences over time. And you'll have your own assessment of how successful any one of those resolutions is. All of the ways that we approach difference must almost necessarily be affected by our context, what we think is normal, the place we serve. Some of our working is affected by our deepest spiritual values, but sometimes they're hard to bring up because we get focused on the mechanisms and how we do it and what people should do. And I think sometimes one of the things that makes it difficult for us to have good discussion about issues that separate us within the family is that we're still surprised that people think differently than we do. I'm a United Methodist. Why doesn't everyone agree with me, right? I mean, it's sort of silly to say out loud, but at the base, I think we get surprised at the variety of difference that there is. And so we need to learn ways to validate that difference, to honor it, to really listen for it. And to know that some of that is, and some of the ways that we can be, our own spiritual life can be enriched, is by learning something about the context that formed the differences, thinking about the things that other people know and contribute to the body, and taking account of that larger conversation. So the difference is going to continue no matter how the church resolves this, about this issue and about the next issue. That it just is natural to people being together in community. Now I want to move to talking particularly about how the church has positioned itself around this matter of LGBTQIA people. Right? Plus. Yeah. Right. So our language is continually evolving. As we look back at the historical documents, we can also see that our language is evolving. And we're talking about something that is not just an issue or a point of view, but we're talking about people, we're talking about families, we're talking about sisters and brothers. The way we talk is important, and I always try to check myself when I've talked about it as an issue to remind myself that we're really talking about people and how the church deals with people. And that may be helpful to you as you facilitate also. So the first time this issue was explicitly addressed in the Book of Discipline was in 1972. Those of you who've had a chance to do some of the suggested reading will see that. And you'll know that it came as a motion from the floor. It wasn't something that was worked on by a committee. It didn't have it didn't have a study committee behind it. It was a motion from the floor that was adopted and incorporated into the 1972 Book of Discipline. In the 45 years since then, we have, at every general conference, there have been motions on the one hand to strengthen the position and on the other hand to soften it. So we've talked about if the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, what does that mean for us? And if homosexual persons are persons of sacred worth, what does that mean to us? We've had study committees. We've worked on having conversations about this before. And we really haven't come to a place where we are at peace about it. So right now the church is raising this question about, is division the right way to go forward? And there are some people who are of the view that the church has spent enough time on this and that it is a distraction from the core mission. There are some people who are just saying we have so little common ground on this matter that it affects how we can do mission together. And we have a whole group of others who are saying, but can't we, but isn't there, but what about, and looking for a way forward. And I think that's kind of the background for what happened at the 2016 General Conference. There was a lot of anxiety about how the church was going to proceed on this matter. Those of you who follow the General Conference closely know that the Commission on the General Conference had proposed a new way of procedural rules that they thought would move us into a different kind of conversation about it, because we clearly didn't want to repeat what had been done before. We spent a lot of conference time debating what was proposed as Rule 44, so if you want to look it up, that's how you might find it. And those rules were not accepted. The conference had engaged in some debate about this, and finally, from the floor, came a resolution to ask the bishops to take this back, to talk to each other, and to find a way to offer the church leadership. It's very interesting at General Conference. How many of you have been to General Conference? Okay, good. Thank you. So you'll know, but the bishop presides, a bishop presides at each session of the General Conference, but they don't vote. They don't make speeches unless they're presenting a report. And they may have, bishops have different ways of acting with their delegations, and some of them have very clear points of view, and others are working hard at making sure that the delegation has a space to express its point of view rather than trying to impose their particular viewpoint. So it was a very interesting request in that context to ask the bishops to actually speak into the setting. So it required them to, or invited them kind of to leave the chair in a way. And so they received that, they worked on how they would proceed, and they proposed this process of developing a commission on the way forward. The commission is a group of 30-some people, 32 I think. They were formed to offer advice and support to the council as the council decides what to bring to the 2019 General Conference. In your packets, you have a paper describing the scope, mission, and vision of the commission, and you'll want to take a look at that as you move towards facilitation of your groups. The commission was formed to clearly give representation to different points of view. So it includes people who are very active across the spectrum of the conversation. And the commission selection made a point of making sure that some openly LGBT people were members. It represents the global church, and some of us might feel that there's not quite enough laity there, but it was an attempt to really provide a group that would give good advice, give sound advice to the Council of Bishops. Has 3 Episcopal moderators, and they've spent a lot of time, as you will see if you go to the website under the Council of Bishops where they talk about the commission, you'll see the reports talk about a lot of time spent in relationship building. They've done spiritual work together, they've tried to understand each other's points of view, they have tried to build relationships, and they've worked with a format in a book called The Anatomy of Peace, which you'll see them refer to, which is has some tools about understanding your role in a conflict and understanding how to intervene in a way that might de-escalate rather than escalate the conflict. So that's the solid foundation that they were attempting to build. They have some things that they have committed to. They say they're driven by values of unity and mission. They've really worked on what the common theological center is in their time together. They feel very strongly that the church will not look like the current church. So they've been trying to envision something different. They have a commitment to seeing if they can provide a space where people with contradictory convictions can flourish. What would it look like? They've said things like it may mean that there's multiple books of discipline. Right? So they're really working on get out of the box, right? Just think about what would be possible. The church should be dynamic, flexible, and contextual. It may mean a way for groups to be in ministry separately while sharing some common ministry. So what can we do together, and what would we need to do separately? They've talked about of course, we all kind of judge ourselves against Jesus' prayer for unity, the priestly prayer where he prayed for the disciples. And they have been speculating about whether there is a way that we could manifest unity but still have separate affiliations. So would it be a federation of viewpoints? Would it be a church with multiple branches? How much separation is required for flourishing? And how much unity can we invest in? Those are the kinds of questions that they've been asking. 3 different possibilities were laid out for the council. And you can see these, you don't need to take notes, but I just want to say them in the room so that you have them in your minds. One is something like the current stance in the Book of Discipline with enhanced emphasis on accountability. That's one way the church could go. Another would be to remove the restrictive language. Explicitly, I take it, allow contextualization, but also find a way to honor people with convictions that wouldn't allow them to celebrate a same-sex marriage or other things. It's not elaborated. I'm trying to imagine what they mean, but honor those with convictions that would object to the removal of the language. And the third is to have a core of both doctrine and service, and the Council of Bishops would be in the core, according to the press release, but that would develop different branches in which people might flourish separately. Each of the plans, the reporter says, is designed to also allow a gracious exit. Now, because I'm not there, it wasn't there, I don't know whether that refers to clergy being able to take their credentials, or whether it refers to church property, or what it really means. So what will happen from here is that the commission has heard the feedback from the council. They'll continue their work. They'll make a presentation to the council meeting in May, and the council will decide what to bring to the special session of the General Conference. We are scheduled to be able to see those proposals in July, so July of 2018. That's the time that I think the DCA, the Daily Christian Advocate, for the special session is supposed to be produced. The materials, of course, will have to be translated, so there's a lot of work to be done right in that May to July timeframe to prepare the things for the General Conference to do its work. And then the special session will be in February of 2019.